Hello guys, so today's video is about SAS cable selection. This is one of the most frequent questions I get from buyers who buy IT mode HBA cards from me. Things like this is an H310 with IT firmware already pre-flashed, and I sell these on my eBay store, the Artist server. And a lot of times people buy this card, they're getting ready to build their FreeNAS server, and then the immediate question after they buy the card is, well, what kind of cable do I need to connect this to my hard drives or to my backplane and whatnot? So if you've been around computers for the last decade or so, you're probably pretty familiar in the consumer space. Connecting hard drives usually involves these Sata connectors. And Sata connectors have been around for quite a long time now. And its predecessor, the IDE connector, was around for quite a long time as well. So in the consumer space, these hard drive connections, they don't really change that much. They get faster a little bit over time, but the connectors themselves seem to be pretty standard and long lasting. Now, if you're fairly new to the enterprise computing hardware space, then it can be quite daunting because SAS connectors like this seem to evolve fairly rapidly. So over time, there's been a lot of different type of SAS connectors. And so it can be a little overwhelming and daunting at first when you have to figure out, well, what kind of cable do I need, right? So the process of selecting the cable that will work for your particular setup, I kind of have this rule that I go by. You can remember it with the acronym COLD. And so it stands for C, which is for connector type, O, which is for orientation, L for length, and D for direction. All right, so these are the four kind of factors that you need to consider when you're shopping for your SAS cables. And I'll kind of briefly go over what I mean by those things, okay? So if you buy an HBA card or even a RAID card or any kind of SAS controller, they're going to have these Sas ports, and in particular, this particular one has this kind of rectangular shape with a single slot connector. So that is called an 8087 or a SFF 8087 connector. And the male side that goes into that looks like this. Okay, so it's a plastic connector, usually with a metal spring latch, okay? And there's a single PCB board inside in the middle that has pins on both sides of the board, and I believe it's something like 36 pins in total. And this thing plugs in here, and that board in the middle goes into that slot. Okay, and as you just probably heard, when it goes in, it usually makes a clicking sound because that's when the spring latch, okay, latches onto those two little holes here on this metal shield on the outside. Okay, so in order to release it, you got to press down on that spring. Okay, you hear that latch. Okay, make sure when you plug it in that click, you hear that click. Otherwise, it might be a little bit loose and your connections might not be very secure. Okay, so you plug it in until you hear the click, and then you can tug on it a little bit, and if the latch is properly engaged, it's not going to come back out. And so in order to disengage the latch, you just press down on the spring and it comes back out. Okay, so this is one of the connector types that you'll encounter. And this is called an SFF 8087. And there's a whole bunch of different other type of connectors that I'm going to kind of briefly go over today. Okay, so that SFF 8087 is actually one of the most common type of connectors you're going to encounter, especially with 6 gigabit and up. Another type of connector you might encounter, okay, for example, with this HBA card, are these kind of more squarish connectors, okay? And these are called SFF 8643. All right, and the other side of this is something that looks like this. All right, so it's kind of a squarish connector, and there are two of these PCB boards in here with pins on either side as well. So in a way, it is kind of like this 8087 connector, but kind of split in two and rearranged in a square versus kind of a rectangular shape. So these type of connectors plug into an HBA card like this, and this also has a latch, this little black thing here. It's usually part of the connector. It's not a separate metal spring like the other 8087, and you plug this in, and it doesn't make a very distinct click because it's all plastic, and it's not unlike the metal that will make a louder click sound, but it does latch in. And in order to release it, you kind of press down on this lever and it pulls back out. Okay, so these are the 8643 connectors. Now, one thing I want to note about this is, in particular the 8643, is that this type of connector is all plastic. Okay, and I know that on eBay or Amazon you can buy cables that have the 8643 connector for external applications, and it's really not designed, and neither of these connectors are really designed for external applications. But in particular, the 8643 is something you probably don't want to use as an external connector, and the reason is that these connections are not very secure, first of all. But more importantly is that this connector is entirely made out of plastic, and so is the other side. Whereas on an 8087, okay, at least you have this metal shielding, which is actually really not part of the connector. It's just kind of soldered on. The connector itself is back here with all the pins, and this is just kind of a shield that holds onto the spring latch. But the connector on the 8643 is all plastic, and so is this. And when you plug this in, and let's say you had this running outside, you know, through a slot and outside of your case and going into something else, if someone were to ever get tangled onto this and yank on this cable, okay, there's a very good chance that this connection is going to break. And it's not so much that, you know, you're going to lose connectivity to hard drives. That may cause some data corruption problems and whatnot, but even more so, this latching mechanism may break. And if it breaks on the cable side, you might just be a little bit lucky, because although the cables are not cheap either, this is probably, you know, the side that if you had to have something break, the cable side is the one you want to have broken. Because otherwise, if the plastic breaks on this side, then you've just had a very bad day with your HBA card, because you've just ruined your HBA card due to some accident, right? So so I know you can get these cables with, you know, this 8643 on one end and an external connector on the other end, but I really don't recommend that. Just speaking from experience, I've, you know, seen broken connectors on HBA cards that have the 8643. So anyway, keep that in mind, that these type of connectors are not really meant for external applications. Now, if you do have a external disk shelf and you're wanting to connect your HBA card to that, there are proper ways to do that. The 8643 and the 8087 have an external connector version of themselves, okay? And I'll kind of show you what that looks like here. So this is the equivalent of an 8643, but as an external application. And this is the equivalent of an 8087 for an external application. Okay, and they have a slightly different number. So this is actually called an 8644, and this is called an 8088. All right, and as you'll notice, the entire connector is made out of metal. Okay, the latching mechanism over here is made out of metal. And the other side, I don't have an external card here, but the other side usually, the female plug is also made out of metal. And so these actually make a much stronger, secure connection for external use, so that if you were to tug on it, it won't just accidentally kind of come loose. Okay, so you won't have accidental hard drive disconnects, okay, as easily as you might with an internal connection getting yanked on. But more importantly, you know, these things, even if they do come loose, are not likely to break like the 8643 that I was showing you earlier. The 8643 connectors are rather fragile. It doesn't take a lot of effort to break them. And so, you know, if you're using, if you have an external setup, you know, I really don't recommend using 8643. Get yourself a proper external HBA card with an 8644 connection or an 8088 connection. Okay, So this is what you need for an external connection. All right, so those are some of the connector types for connecting on the side of the HBA. Now, that's just one side of the cable. The other side of the cable, okay, you also have to figure out what kind of connector you're going to need on that. Now, one of the most common type of setups that people do is to connect them directly to your hard drives, and that's a perfectly fine way to set it up. So in that case, you're going to need what's called a breakout cable. So you're going to have one end like this, that's an 8087 that goes into your controller, and you're going to have the other end being SATA connectors directly plugged into your SATA hard drives. Okay, so this is the type of connectors that you're going to need if you're connecting one of these HBA cards directly to your hard drive. All right, and there are different types of cables like this. So here's another one that's rather nice. It has an 8087 that goes into the SAS controller or your HBA card, and it's got these staggered length SATA right angle connectors. And so this is kind of nice because oftentimes the distance from your HBA connector to your hard drives is not going to be the same, and as you move further away, you're going to need more cable, and so this is just kind of a nice staggered cable, so you don't have excess cable on the hard drive that's closest to you. And the right angle also is a nice touch sometimes for certain applications. Doesn't always work, but in certain situations this can be very convenient to have the right angle. All right, so that's a very common way to connect an HBA card like this directly to your hard drives. Now let's say that you're connecting to SAS hard drives instead of SATA hard drives. Then you're going to need a slightly different cable. So in that scenario, you're going to need a cable that's a little bit more like this, and it has these connectors here that go into the SAS hard drive. So this is looks very similar to a SATA connector, the entire connector, where this side is power and this side is data. But as you may know, SAS does not have a gap between the power and the data channel. Instead, it has a bridge here, and that bridge often carries a secondary data channel. And so therefore, the SATA plug will not plug into a SAS hard drive because of that, because there is no gap here. So if you're going with SATA SAS hard drives, you're going to need a connector like this, and this is called an 8482, I believe. And so this is the type of cable you're going to need. Now in this case, I've got two 8482 connectors. Here's the SATA power plug that provides power to these two connectors, and it goes into an 8087. Now, of course, you can see that this is kind of missing half itself, because only half of the pins here are connected, since the 8087 is designed to carry 4 SAS lanes, whereas I only have 2 SAS connectors here. So it's basically a half cable, okay? But you can get other cables that will connect all 4 SAS lanes, and you'll have 4 of these 8482 connectors to connect one of these 8087 ports to 4 SAS hard drives. Now, if you do get this kind of cable, you can also connect a SATA hard drive to this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Oftentimes most of the SAS components will accept SATA, but the reverse is not true. SATA components often will not allow connecting SAS hardware. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, once you figured out how you want to connect your HBA card, okay, so figure out the connector type on your HBA card is an 8087 like this, or if it's an external card, it might have an 8088 port coming out the PCI bracket. Or you might have a different card that has an 8643 connector. So you're gonna have to figure that out first. And if you're buying from one of my listings on eBay, usually in the description, I'll give you the details on what kind of port is on that card. So if you're having a hard time identifying by the photos, just read the description in my listings, and I'll usually give you the specific details on that. And then the other end of that cable is either going to a hard drive, either to SATA ports like this, or to SAS 8482 connectors, or in some situations you might have a backplane. And so in the situation of a backplane, it might be common for it to go to another 87 connector. So just as an example here, here is a 24 bay direct attach backplane. And so you'll see in this case, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 connectors, SAS connectors here that are the 8087 variety, right? They look basically identical to what's on this card, and there's 6 of them. So in a scenario like this, you're going to need a cable that has an 8087 connector on both ends, one going to the HBA card and one going into your backplane like that. Okay. Now other backplanes might have different type of connectors. You might have a more slightly modern backplane that has an 8643, and so then you'll need a cable that has an 8643 connector on the side you want to connect to the backplane. Now if you're using some slightly older hardware, you might have a backplane that has this older connector here. And this is called an 8484 connector, or SFF 8484. And it kind of looks like a Sata port that's multiplied by 4, and indeed that's kind of more or less what it is. This also carries 4 SAS lanes. So on older backplanes, you might see a connector that looks like this. And so you'll want to get a cable that has the 8484 connector that goes into your backplane, and a whatever connector you need on the other end. In this case, this is an 8087, so this would actually work with that card right here going into a backplane. All right, so that's connector types. That's one of the most important things you have to start out with, is figure out the type of connectors you're going to need. From the HBA to your hard drive or to your backplane, figure the connector types that you need. Okay, so the second point is orientation, right? So COLD, O is for orientation. And what I mean by that is that these connectors, now once you've decided or figured out what connector type you need, the connectors can come in different orientations. And so just to give you an example, this was the 8087 connector, and it's a standard straight connector. This is kind of the most common thing you might find. But sometimes you'll have, this is a right angle connector. As you'll see, it kind of bends towards the back. And I've also seen, I don't have a sample of it right here, but I've seen these 8087 connectors also right angle to the left and to the right as well. So there are actually 4 different orientations of the 8087 connector that you can find. And there might even be one where it's kind of bend like this, except with the latch on the other side. I haven't seen those myself, but I'm sure that's possible. So there are at least 5 or 4, if not 5, different orientations of this cable alone, or this type of connector alone, right? And here you'll see also this is kind of a right angle. There are straight versions of this, the 8643 as well. And so there are different orientations of this connector as well. And also, as we saw earlier here, with the SATA connectors, this would be your standard straight SATA connector, whereas this is a right angle SATA connector. All right, and so, and you can also have right angles that go the other direction. So there are at least 3 different orientations of a SATA connector. And you need to consider whether, these type of orientations are going to help your setup or not. And in some cases, it may not fit at all. So, just going back to this backplane here, if I had a cable with a right angle like this, where it needs to fit into this port like this, as you can see, this cable would then be running into this PCB board. And so this cable would not, or at least this end of the cable would not work in this situation at all, right? So there are certain orientations that will not work with your setup, and you need to consider what will work best. Some backplanes I've seen with an 8087 connector have the connector coming straight out of the board, and right behind it perhaps might be a wall of fans. And so the clearance between the connector sticking out and the wall of fans might be very, very tight. And so having a straight connector plug in this way can be very inconvenient, because you might have the cable running into the fan wall. And so in that case, it might be beneficial to have some sort of right angle connector. So you have to take those things into consideration and figure out what type of orientation of the connector that will suit your need best. Another example of where the orientation of the connector matters is, with you'll see a lot of cards that are more like this, where the connectors are coming out the end in a vertical, in a horizontal fashion. And these are usually more flexible in terms of how you can run the cables. But some cards will have the connectors in a more vertical orientation. And these cards are usually okay if you're in a chassis that has a full height PCI slot. But if you're in a half height PCI slot, case like a 2U server chassis, this spacing can get very tight. But fortunately, these usually are designed to take into account that type of tight clearance. And so in this case, there's a cutout here. And if you were to plug in a straight connector like this, okay, as you can see, if this was the top of the chassis, this cable would, you'd have to bend it, and it probably could still be done, but it would be very tight. Whereas if you got a right angle connector like this one, it would fit into that cutout perfectly and give you, a much better, way of routing this cable. So orientation does matter and can make a difference in terms of how you connect things and whatnot. So orientation, that's also another thing you need to consider once you figure out what type of connectors you need. All right. And so then the last, or not the last, but the third point is length. And that one I think is fairly straightforward. You need to know what length of cable you need. So there are a lot of different lengths. There are very short cables like this. This one is very useful for connecting to an HBA card that goes in one end, and perhaps maybe a expander card next to it, right? So you might have a very short connection and you don't want a lot of excess cable that might block your airflow. And so a short cable would be a great case for that. In some other situations, your backplane or your hard drives might be further away and you need a longer cable. So you need to measure and figure out what length of cable you need. And usually I would recommend adding at least 1 inch or 2 inches to that cable length so you have yourself a little bit of slack. Now, as far as, and that's fairly straightforward, but just one tip about measuring the length. Don't assume that don't assume that you need to measure the shortest path. Most of the time, that's not going to be the way you're going to route the cable. And I'll just kind of give you an example here. Here is a motherboard with an onboard 8087 SAS controller. Now, here are the 8087 ports, and let's say as an example, you need to connect it to this location right here. So I would not measure this point to this point directly, okay? Because you're not going to run your cable straight from one point to another. Oftentimes what you're going to do is you're going to run the cables through a different path. So in this case, as an example, you might run the cables straight out here. You might say go up a fan wall. You might make a 90-degree turn and come over here, and then you might go down into a connector here, right? So you need to figure out how you're going to route the cable and then measure the length of that particular path. And then I would say add 1 inch to whatever your measurement is to give yourself a little bit of slack. Okay, so don't always assume that you're just going to measure the shortest path and then go out and buy the cable. Figure out how you're going to route the cable. In a server chassis, you might encounter the scenario I just mentioned where this cable comes out, hits a fan wall, you might have to go around the fans, whatnot. In a desktop-oriented chassis, a lot of times behind the motherboard mounting plate is a lot of space for cable management, and there are cutouts around the mother plate, so you might want to route your cables through one of those holes, go behind the motherboard, and then go to wherever your hard drive cage or whatever it is however it is set up in your system. And so just don't assume that it's going to be the shortest path. Figure out how you're going to route the cable, measure the length of that path, and then go from there. And again, add about 1 inch or so to the measured length to give yourself a little bit of slack. Okay, so that covers the length part. And then D is for direction. Okay, and this last point is probably the most important one that gets people. Okay, a lot of times I've had people contact me and say, hey, I got your HBA card, thank you very much. I've just connected it to my hard drives and nothing's showing up. Okay, so In that scenario, one of the first questions I'll often ask is, okay, can you what kind of cable is it that you use, or can you give me the model number of the cable? And I'll go look it up, and sure enough, what it turns out to be is a reverse breakout cable. Okay, so let me kind of explain that. So earlier, I didn't really kind of specify that because I wanted to wait until I get the segment here, but here are two breakout cables, right? I had this going from an 8087 to SATA breakout, and this is similar. It's an 8087 to SATA breakouts in a staggered fashion, okay? But these two cables are actually functionally very different, all right? And I'm not talking about the the type of wiring or the color of the cables and whatnot. I'm saying they're wired differently. Okay, they may look identical in terms of, hey, there's 8087 connector and SATA connectors on the other end, but this red one actually is called a reverse breakout cable, and it's meant for a different purpose. This is actually the forward breakout cable, and this is meant to connect from the controller on the 8087 and to the hard drives on the SATA ports. Okay, this cable, on the other hand, known as reverse breakout, is actually meant for these SATA ports to go into a SATA controller. So as an example, it might plug into the SATA ports on a motherboard, and the other end is meant to go into the backplane where the hard drives are. And so, for example, you might have a 4-port backplane that has one of these connectors, and you don't have an extra HBA card, and you don't really want to get one, but you can still drive that backplane with the onboard SATA ports, right? And so you would get a cable like this, which is a reverse breakout cable, which is meant not to have hard drives on the SATA end, but to have a SATA controller on the SATA end. And these are wired differently than the forward breakout cable, okay? And so if you accidentally get one of these reverse breakout cables and plug it into the HBA on these 8087 side, and you plug in your hard drives on this side, the hard drives are not going to show up. Okay, so that's one thing to be very careful of. The cables, will look pretty much identical, so you can't really identify them by looking at them. The only way to identify whether you have a reverse or forward breakout cable, well, there's only two ways. One, the product description tells you so when you buy the cable, or you get a multimeter and you measure, figure out the pinout on these cables and match it to the specification, and it'll tell you whether you have a reverse or forward breakout arrangement in the pins here. Okay, so the easiest way probably is just to make sure when you buy the cable, look at the product description, make sure it is not a reverse breakout cable unless you really intend to use to set it up the way I just described, where this goes into the SATA controller. Okay, so directionality matters, and that can be a big problem. So with the SATA breakout cables, that's one case of that. But also in the scenario where you have, this 8484 to 8087, this also has a directionality. Okay, this particular cable is designed for the 8087 to go into a controller, a SAS controller, and for the 8484 to go into a backplane. But there are older SAS controllers that have an 8484 connector type 2, and you might want to plug that RAID controller or SAS controller into a backplane that has an 8087. Now, the two connectors would look identical, but in those cables, but this particular cable would not work in that scenario. This is wired, okay, the way the wires are connected, this is wired for this side to be on the controller and this side to be on the backplane. Sometimes it'll be labeled as this side is the host side and this side is the target side, okay? And there are cables where that's reversed, where this is the host side and this is the target side. And so if you're dealing with some slightly older hardware where you have an 8484 connector and an 8087 or some other type of connector, be careful that these cables have a directionality. Okay, so they're not symmetrical. You can't just plug them into the different sides and expect them to work. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So that's the last part in terms of directionality. Okay, so if you figure out the connector type, figure out the orientation that works for your hardware setup, figure out the length that's going to work for the way you're going to route your cables, and figure out the directionality of the cable that you need, okay, that will give you all the information you need to go shop for the appropriate cable for your setup. All right, so now one last thing, there's often a misconception about the protocol versus the connector type. So a lot of times people will assume that if you have an 8087, for example, that this is going to be for a 6 gigabit or SAS 2, and that if you have an 8643, that this is going to be for SAS 3, which is the 12 gigabit protocol. Okay, that is very common to have something like that. You know, a lot of 6 gigabit SAS 2 controllers will have an 8087, and a lot of SAS 3 controllers will have the 8643. Okay, and the similar scenario for the external equivalents that we just saw earlier, like this. But that assumption is not always going to be true. Okay, so and it's not going to be true more times than you think. Okay, so just as an example here, this particular HBA card has the 8643, but this is actually a 6 gigabit card. Okay, so this is not a not a SAS 3 or 12 gigabit card. This is a 6 gigabit card, and it has an 8643 connector. All right, and I do have and I don't have it with me right now, but there is an HP SAS 3, okay, 12 gigabit HBA card that uses 86 or the 8087 connectors. All right, so the assumption that these type of connectors, you know, the type is correlated somehow with the supported speed of the controller, that's not something I would automatically assume. All right, so just because you're buying a SAS 3 HBA card, don't assume that it's going to have an 8643. Okay, a lot of times it will, but not all the time. And just because you're buying a SAS 2, a 6 gigabit HBA, don't assume it's always going to be an 8087. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind that I find people often confuse or kind of make the wrong assumption. All right, so hopefully that will help you guys figure out what kind of cable you need once you've got your HBA. And you know, just so remember, once again, connector type, orientation, length, and directionality. Okay, and that's all you need to know to figure out the cable type that you need. All right, so hopefully that's been helpful, and thank you for watching. Please remember to click on like if you like this video, and please subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos from me. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.